But if you have time, could you maybe take some questions? We can go through some of these comments. If anybody wanted to join in the StreamYard chat to ask Gary personally, are you okay with that? Or
Sure, sure. Go ahead.
so if we could put the link in the chat, if you want to join us, ask Gary. If you have a comment for today's session, for today's interview, or any questions regarding what we've gone over today. I've got some comments here, if you can see them. We got Michelle Silver. She says, "Wow, mind blowing. Said so simply, and with a sound mind. Makes sense." So very good. Someone said here, incorrect. Matthew 24. So
I don't know what that means.
me neither. If you can elaborate more, that'll be great. Roland saying, "Great breakdown." What else we got here? We got Revelation. And for those who wanted to join in on the chat, we've got the link in there. So just click on the link and you can join us live. It says, it's Revelation 20 and 4. It says, because I think you mentioned about Revelations, it says, "In which had not worshipped the beast, neither the image, neither had received the mark on their foreheads and their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years."
Yeah, but notice it doesn't say they reigned with Christ for 1,000 years on the earth. And notice
Mm.
this. Notice what it says. These were ones who were beheaded. So you're not giving the whole verse. They're beheaded. Now, if they're beheaded, that means they died. And to live as Christ and to die is gain. So they live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years, but they're not reigning on earth because they're dead. So there's no verse in Revelation chapter 20 that says that Jesus reigns on the earth for 1,000 years, because what that position teaches is that Jesus reigns on the earth for 1,000 years, sets up another temple is built. So not only do we have the rebuilt temple in Herod's day, it's called Herod's temple. Yeah, that one, the rebuilt temple, and then you have a temple that's supposed to be rebuilt during the seven year period, yet in our future. That's destroyed again. Then you have to build another temple during this 1,000 year period, where Jesus is supposed to be reigning on the earth, but it doesn't say he's reigning on the earth. It says these martyrs live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. They're in heaven. And then not only that, but they have to have animal sacrifices during this 1,000 year period based upon the book of Ezekiel. It's a crazy system. And the people, and it actually said, and if you go back to the Ezekiel passages in Ezekiel chapter 40 and following, it says that these are for atonement. And they'll say, well, and yet the whole book of Hebrews dismisses animal sacrifices. If you look at Hebrews chapter 9, the whole idea of bulls and goats and so forth is done away with. Again, people are reading into the Bible things that aren't there. Revelation 20 does not say Jesus is going to reign on the earth for 1,000 years. The ones who reign with Jesus are people who have been martyred.
That's right. There's planting and watering. They've got a few comments here. Israel is still alive and here. If not, the moon would not be in the sky.
I think I know what they're saying. Israel being alive today is basically irrelevant. There are Jews alive today, and there's not a single verse in the New Testament that says anything about Israel becoming a nation again and it being significant for Bible prophecy.
Yeah, I came from that. I actually come from that school of thought where we had to go tell the Israelites who they were, because end day prophecy pertains to them, so on and so forth. So, and if that is the case, it almost contradicts New Covenant, the New Covenant practices that the apostles did, because they did none of that.
Yeah, I mean, and here's another thing: a lot of people who hold this end time position don't like to talk about. During this 7 year period, now the tribulation period takes place within this 7 years, which is Daniel's 70th week. Daniel Daniel's given a prophecy of 70 weeks of years. That turns out to be 490 years. I won't go into all the details of this. It's in my
Yep.
book, Last Days Madness. But they maintain there's a gap between the 69th week and the 483, comes down to 483 years, and the final 7 years. And so we're living in this gap between the 69th week and the 70th week, which is nearly 2,000 years long. And supposedly what's going to happen is the rapture, the church is going to be taken off the earth before, during, after, or before God's wrath is poured out in this 7-year period. Now, here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand about that position. This group, Planting and Watering, says Israel is still alive and here. But to this modern day prophetic system that says that this is still about the future, guess what that position believes is going to happen to Israel during the tribulation period? 2/3 of them are going to be slaughtered. So we're to believe, based upon this system, that God waits so far close to 2,000 years, then all of a sudden he is going to deal with Israel again. The prophecy clock is going to start up again, and God is going to rapture his church out, and God is going to deal with Israel during this 7-year period. And supposedly the Antichrist is supposed to come. He's supposed to make a covenant and then break the covenant with Israel. He's supposed to rebuild the temple, all this kind of stuff. And none of that is found in the Bible anywhere. But part of that position is that 2/3 of the Jews are going to be slaughtered. It's going to be another Holocaust for the Jews. So when Romans chapter 11 says, and in this way all Israel will be saved, and they see this as have something to do with this 7-year period, well, all Israel isn't going to be saved, because according to their position, 2 or 3 million Jews are going to be slaughtered in Israel as a result of all this. See, what we've got here from this organization, Planting and Watering, is simply taking Old Testament covenant language and skipping over the redemptive work of Jesus, and skipping over that generational judgment that took place then and there, and it's over with, and then projecting this into the future where all this is supposed to take place again, and not reminding the Christians that Jews are going to be slaughtered again. It's an impossible system, and you just won't find it in the Bible. This is it's just something that just isn't found in Scripture.
If we got another one from Natalia Bella, it says, Dr. Gary DeMar, what is your view on preterist idealism?
Let's take the word preterism. Preterism simply means past. If you're a Christian, you are a preterist because you believe all the prophecies in the Old Testament relating to the first coming of Jesus have been fulfilled. The fulfillment is in our past. So that's what the word preterist means. There's a preterite tense I think in Latin, which means it's a past tense. And so I am a preterist on Matthew chapter 24 and the book of Revelation and other passages, because I believe the fulfillment of those prophecies are in our past. I believe they were prophecies when they were given, but since now they're fulfilled, they're in the past. Idealism is, when you read the book of Revelation, what you're not reading history at all. It's not dealing with any specific things that take place in history. It's the ideas, kind of the symbolic nature of the book of Revelation that can be applied in every era. So a person could be a preterist, believing that the book of Revelation was already fulfilled, but that the principles related in the book of Revelation still apply. And I agree with that. In fact, I agree with that with all fulfilled prophecy. I believe Matthew chapter 24 has application to today. Every prophecy in the Bible has application for us today. Just because something was for Israel doesn't mean it doesn't have application today. In fact, otherwise, why read the Old Testament? Why read the book of Psalms? Why read Psalm 18, which talked about David and Saul? It all applies today. So there is an idealist application to all Scripture, and including prophecy. I think John Noe is a preterist idealist. I don't call myself that, but I understand it, and I think there are a lot of very helpful things in the idealist view. But I still believe that the book of Revelation refers to events leading up to and including the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Good question. Good question. Even Paul said things are written aforetime are written for our learning. So let's go. Another one here. We said, when was the book of Matthew written? If written decades after 70 AD, can that indicate that it was written only as a record of what occurred in the past, therefore confirming fulfillment?
Well, of course, this assumes that the book of Matthew was written after AD 70. I believe all the New Testament books are written before AD 70. It's kind of a strange way to write a book after the fact, and not present that book as history. And when for example, Josephus was a Jew who had gone over to the Roman side and wrote the War of the Jews, which is a history, a description, because he was an eyewitness to the events of the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in AD 70. But when you read Josephus, which was obviously written after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, he writes it as history. So what you would have here, if the book of Matthew was written after AD 70, that the writer was lying to us because the writer was presenting it as prophecy rather than history. But I believe all the New Testament books are written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Because
Yes,
Luke, for example, he's talking to eyewitnesses. If you look at Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, he did investigative work with witnesses. So let's assume Matthew, for example, is written after AD 70. That means Luke was written before AD 70 because there were still eyewitnesses. And Luke basically tells the same story that Matthew does on the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem that took place before that generation passed away.
we got another one here from Planting and Watering. He's got a lot of questions. Maybe you could just click the link and join us.
He says, I'm dealing with replacement theology. What I'm finding from this particular group or person is these are standard objections with the people who typically answer or ask these types of questions have never done their own research. Let me explain what replacement theology is. Replacement theology claims people who hold replacement theology that the church, the ecclesia, I'm going to use a little Greek here, the ecclesia, I'm not going to use the word church, I'm going to use the word ecclesia, which is the Greek word translated as church.
There's interesting history. I heard the history you put out about that word church. Yeah. A lot of people are not familiar with that.
No, they're not. And this person obviously isn't either. They're essentially just spouting off typical standard rebuttals to a position. This is their argument that Israel rejected Jesus as the Messiah, and as a result of that, the prophecy clock related to Israel stopped, and then God dealt with a new entity, a brand new entity called the church, and that we are now living in the church age, and that those who hold replacement theology say what the church replaces Israel, and therefore those who hold the replacement theology dismiss Israel as God's chosen people. That's essentially what this person is accusing me of, that I believe that the church has replaced Israel. Now, I don't believe any such thing. I do not believe that the prophetic clock stopped at the end of the 69th week. I do not believe that the church replaces Israel. And I'm going to try to I'll explain my position. Jesus made it very clear. If you look at Matthew chapter 10, it says, "You will not finish going through the cities of Israel until the Son of Man comes." Now, what is that all about? I'll tell you what it's all about. It says, "To the Jew first," and Paul talks about this as well. The gospel went to the Jews first. On Pentecost, what does it say in Acts chapter 2, verse 5? There were Jews living in Israel in Jerusalem from every nation under heaven. Who embraced Jesus as the promised Messiah first? Israel did. The Jews did. So that means that the Jews, the Israel remnant that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 9, made up the ecclesia. Now, how do we know that? Because in Acts chapter 5, verse 11, it's the first mention of the ecclesia in the book of Acts, and it's made up exclusively of Jews. And then you get to, and so now this is extremely important. You don't really find Gentiles involved in any of this yet. This is to the Jew first. And the first people, the 5,000, the 3,000, and the others, the priests and so forth that came to Jesus, the covenantal promises made to Israel were being fulfilled right then and there in the book of Acts. And you don't really see the Gentiles being, well, the one other place. If you go to Acts chapter 7, Stephen is given this history, a redemptive history of Israel. And he talks about the ecclesia in the wilderness. And if you look at the King James, it translates it as the church in the wilderness. William Tyndale, when he translated the New Testament, when he came across the word ecclesia, he translated it as congregation or assembly, not as church. It was King James who insisted that the Greek word ecclesia be translated as church and not as congregation or assembly. In fact, William Tyndale was burned at the stake because he was translating the Greek word ecclesia as assembly or congregation. And I have a book that deals with all this and the history of all this. I won't go into this right now, but here's an important point. In the Old Testament, of course, was written in Hebrew with some Aramaic in the book of Daniel and Jeremiah. When the Septuagint, when the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was published, the Hebrew word kahal in the Old Testament was translated as ecclesia. That means every time, not every time, but most of the times you saw the Hebrew word kahal, and you picked up the Greek translation, which was the Septuagint, was written around maybe the 4th century BC. It was the Greek translation was ecclesia. What did kahal refer to? It referred to the congregation of Israel, the believing congregation of Israel. Now you go into the New Testament and you pick up a Hebrew translation of the Greek New Testament, you will find that ecclesia is translated as kahal. So the ecclesia isn't anything new in the New Testament. It simply means the congregation. You'll see the same thing in Hebrews chapter 2, where a quotation from the Old Testament and the word ecclesia is used. There's nothing new about the ecclesia in the New Testament. The first members of the ecclesia in the New Testament were Jews. It was Israel. Nothing was being replaced. What you find in the New Testament is that the Gentiles, the nations, were grafted in to an already existing Jewish Israelite ecclesia. And this was, if you look at Acts chapter 9, you find that Peter is in Joppa. What's Peter's full name? Simon Bar Jonah. And he is in Joppa. And he is with a tanner using Tanner using has dead animals making skins, something a Jew would not be involved in, representing the dead. And Joppa is the place where Jonah tried to escape from going to Nineveh. All right? And what happens in the very next chapter? Peter is given a vision of unclean animals coming down out of heaven. And Peter is told by God to take, kill, and eat. And Peter says, I've never eaten any unclean things. He says, don't call unclean what I call clean. And he's talking about the nations. And now Peter goes out and he says, I had this vision, and now the gospel goes to the nations. That Gentiles are now grafted into an already existing ecclesia made up then almost exclusively of Jews. So this charge of replacement theology, the church doesn't replace Israel. The original church, the original ecclesia was made up exclusively of Jews, of Israelites. So again, this is just kind of typical of people who really haven't studied this on their own. They're simply parroting what other critics have said. And in fact, I debated Michael Brown about this.
Yes.
And Michael Brown, he admitted, he said, Gary, I agree with you on your exegesis of all this. And he says he still holds out for Israel, Jews being redeemed in the future. So do I. I believe that. I believe that there are going to be people from every tongue, nation under heaven, but they all have to come the same way, and that is through Jesus. Then I asked him the question. I said, please tell me on your position how you answer Zechariah chapter 13, verses 7 through 9, which talks about 2/3 of the Jews living in Israel during this tribulation period are going to be slaughtered. How is it you can say that God is finally, in the end of history, he's going to come back and he's going to redeem Israel, and then he's going to let 2/3 of them be slaughtered by the Antichrist? And he didn't have an answer for me. He said he was going to get back with me on it. He never has.